With everything going on in Iraq and Israel, we've not talked as much about the immigration situation in the last few days, but it is no less important, and it didn't stop because those events are going on. Members of the Black Leadership Group, Project 21, Black Leadership Network, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and study findings from academia from Cornell, University of Chicago, and Harvard have all cited statistics that show that the black population will suffer greatly if the president does take unilateral executive action to grant work permits to millions of illegal aliens. And that specter is still out there. It has not yet been answered by the president, and we'll wait and see. But with us this morning is a gentleman we've had on before. His name is Joe Hicks. He's a member of the Project 21 Black Leadership Network. He's the vice president of Community Advocates Incorporated, a privately funded Los Angeles-based political think tank. He's an analyst and commentator for PJTV.com, where he hosts the Hicks File and the Minority Report programs. And from 2005 to 2008, he hosted the weekly Joe Hicks Show on KFI AM in Los Angeles. Also, formerly served as the executive director of the Los Angeles City Human Relations Commission from 1997 to 2001, and in the early 1990s was executive director of the Greater Los Angeles chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the civil rights group formed by Martin Luther King Jr. And we are honored to welcome Joe Hicks back to the Gary Sutton Show this morning. Joe, great to have you on again.
Hey, it's good to be with you again.
Just by reading your credits there, that almost took up the whole segment. So, which is to say, you're like me. You've been around for a while, and you've been doing a lot of things while you're around. Do you ever sleep at all?
That must just mean I'm old.
I didn't say that, but anyway, I'm looking at some of the statistics that people came up with on this from Cornell and University of Chicago, Harvard, U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And when you look at black Americans, they have supported the president greatly in the first two elections, obviously the first and last election for this president. But you look at the numbers out there, and especially the unemployment. The 2013 unemployment rate for black people with no high school diploma was 20.5% in this country. And for those with such a diploma, 12.6%. By contrast, the rate was 7.4% for all races and 6.5% for whites. So why the disparaging number difference, and what's going to happen if many of these people come out and we now have this influx of new people who are going to be allowed to work in this country even though they were illegal aliens?
Well, the stats that you cited, sort of demonstrate the problem. We've got a lot of black Americans who, by the way, are A, Americans, and B, citizens.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right now. And they have struggled a great deal as a result of this recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, and still haven't recovered. And the unemployment stats and the poverty rates demonstrate that. So what happens if you, and you got to understand, I see this flow of illegal aliens from across the border from places like Guatemala, El Salvador, other places in Central America, as well as the ongoing flow from Mexico, as literally, importing poverty into this country, because most of those people coming are not brain surgeons. They're not people, going to work in biotech industries. These are extremely low-skilled people with little in the way of education. They bring little to the table except themselves physically that will add to the burden of many communities throughout this country that are already struggling to educate and house and clothe and feed very, very poor people. So the idea that President Obama is threatening to grant amnesty to perhaps 5 up to 8 million new illegal people who mostly will be at that low-end edge of the labor market indicates that many struggling black Americans will find themselves out-competed in that marketplace. Now, what do I mean? Because, black Americans, before citizens, they're aware of things like minimum wage laws, whether one agrees with those or not. They are on the books. There are things like safety regulation, other kind of things that most citizens are aware, conditions you need to work under, how long you're allowed to work before you're paid overtime, those kinds of things. Illegal labor doesn't care about those kind of things. All they know is they're going to come in, they're going to work for less than you're willing to work for, and they'll work off the books. They will work in any way possible. They will work as long as possible because it's a survival mode. And most Americans, regardless of their skin color, can't compete with people that are that desperate to outbid you for whatever the job is you're working for. They will depress the wages of Americans across the board in that lower, entry-level area. It's interesting. I live here in Los Angeles, and if you drive through places like South Central Los Angeles that have been viewed as being the black community, though now it's probably 70% Latinos living there, you won't find a black kid working in a McDonald's, working in a Burger King. They're all Latino laborers working in there. So it poses real difficulty for people that are struggling at that edge of the marketplace, who also have low skills, low education, not a lot to bring to the table. But my argument is, let's give Americans a shot at those jobs before we then bring in yet another group of folks, legalize them, and say go at it. And they're going to mainly be living and working in those same urban areas. That's going to impact black people in a very disproportionate way.
Joe, as we established early, you and I have both been around for a long time, and I hear the age-old comment, well, they're doing jobs that Americans don't want to do, as if to rationalize the fact that, okay, they're coming here illegally, but they work really hard, like Americans don't work hard, I guess, and so they deserve that opportunity, and yet you already pointed out, and I think rightfully so, what it's done to wages in this country over a number of years. I was looking the other day at a story about people working in a meatpacking plant where they used to make like $20-some an hour, and now it's down to 10 because a lot of the plants have hired people who are illegal aliens, who are not, who are simply there, and they're willing to do that. So we have people who are playing the game unfairly in terms of employers in this country, and yet at the same time, they're depressing the wages through their illegal actions. When you hear that idea that they're willing to do things that other Americans, black, white, or indifferent, won't do, what are your thoughts on that?
That's completely bogus, and that was something that, oddly enough, Republican President George Bush threw out when that debate was going on.
When he was wrong.
This is a bipartisan problem. We got both Republicans and Democrats willing to engage in that kind of foolishness. I was driving through upstate New York a few months ago, and I stopped in off the highway at a little kind of food court thing. Mm-hmm. The first thing I noticed was, who's mopping the floors, who's taking the trash out. They were poor white people primarily, doing the jobs that George Bush told us that Americans won't do. Americans will do those jobs. And the problem is we've been subsidizing things in this country with illegal labor. The cost of a tomato should be what a cost of a tomato is based on the prevailing wages. What we've done is allowed people to hire people that are not legal, pay them in many cases off the books. In many cases, our strawberries and our tomatoes are subsidized by the fact that conglomerates can hire people below the prevailing wage levels, which is why our lettuce and tomatoes tends to be, at the price that it is. My thing is, pay a fair wage, pay prevailing labor, let the cost of a head of lettuce float to where it should be. Americans will be willing to pay that if we're employing Americans to do those jobs, as opposed to somebody who comes here from Guatemala, may stay here, may not stay here, has no real investment in the notion of America as an idea, and may go home again at some point. What we're doing is, America should be a place of the rule of law. And by simply continuing this amnesty game, we make a joke of our laws, which say, America has the ability, any sovereign nation has the ability to determine who comes in, why they come in, and when they come in. And there are a lot of people in places like Mexico and other places sitting in line for 10, 15 years trying to do it the right way, the legal way, to come here. And you got people now strolling across the border, offering themselves up to a border patrol guy saying, here I am, take me in, because they know they've slid into home base. Nothing's going to happen to them. So beyond the issue of what that does to, depressing our wages in major cities, is this other issue of how that undercuts the notion of law and allows people to come here illegally, making a mockery of people that have decided to try to do it the right way and come to America because they see it as a land of opportunity and hope for them, but they're not going to make a joke of the law to do that. So there's a lot of things in play around this notion of immigration that I think Americans need to look at squarely and punish politicians. I don't care if they have an R or a D in front or behind their name. Punish those people that aren't going to uphold this nation's laws.
It seems to me, Joe, that we've constructed, we're talking together with Joe Hicks this morning from Project 21 Leadership Network. It seems to me we've constructed this gray area. It's kind of a quasi area when it comes to immigration. Every other area in this country that has the word illegal or legal behind it, we seem to be able to delineate what those two things mean. But when it comes to this, in California, Texas, border states especially, we've come up with this quasi kind of law area where we say, well, and I said this to someone the other day, it was funny as you were talking, I was thinking about this conversation. Someone said, well, if you're going to get tough on immigration, the price of fruits and vegetables are going to go up. I said, well, let me ask you this question. Is it better for them to go up and reestablish that we are a nation that has a rule of law, or is it better to just be a nation that says you're a receptacle for anybody that wants to come here? We really don't have any rules, and therefore we don't have any laws. And what will that yield up someday? And the guy said, well, I just don't want to see my prices go up. That's all you could see, instead of what the long-term look might be to this country with not abiding by our laws and not standing by our laws that we already have in the books.
Well, see, but there's other angles that somebody like this person simply doesn't get, and there are parts of the country that haven't seen this effect yet.
Right.
But I would ask that at some point they, take a little trip down to the borders areas of Texas or Arizona or California and see how just allowing people to come here and supposedly, work and live in, quote, the shadows, and bring with them the cultural influence of these countries without the desire to really integrate themselves in, become Americans, learn English, go with the flow. Instead, they reproduce the same cultural milieu that they left in a little tiny village they lived in El Salvador. And it diminishes the level and the quality of life for everybody. In some parts of this country, we've basically seen areas that are living at a third world level because they brought it here, and we've allowed that to fester and exist here. So, it's really interesting. I was thinking about, you're talking about this issue of this guy, and he just wants his lettuce or tomatoes to be at the right kind of price. Mm-hmm. You look at certain industries like poultry processing and the catfish farming and fish farming in places like Mississippi and Alabama, that once were the kind of jobs that low-skilled, black labor once occupied. Go to a catfish processing site in Mississippi and see who's processing that fish. They're all Spanish-speaking illegal labor. Go to a poultry processing areas of Arkansas and see, again, who's processing those chickens and those plants. It's not local black labor. It's not local poor white labor. It's all, again, immigrant labor doing that. So, people like that have to say, well, do I want that to happen to my nation? And I'm not saying that, a lot of people say, oh, you're anti-immigrant.
Yeah.
And that just literally ticks me off, because to be against people entering your, if I picked up stakes and I love New Zealand. Let me just go live in New Zealand. I'm going to get an entry visa and I'm just going to stay there. How long do you think that would be before the New Zealand authorities would grab me by the scruff of my neck, throw me on a plane, and fly my butt back to America? No country allows people to come in and just live here. And the stories we hear about these kids, the poor kids, coming in across borders because they're fleeing violence and gangs in El Salvador, Honduras. Guess what? When have those conditions not existed? What about all the poor, starving kids in the Congo or Ethiopia or living in the slums in Colombia or Brazil? Should we open our doors and hollow out these countries and fly, 747s to bring kids to America?
Yeah.
I mean, it's ludicrous, yet those are the kind of arguments you hear being floated now by liberals and Democrats, and we're supposed to just open our hearts and let this happen, forgetting that what's at stake here is this nation and its sovereignty and our ability to operate as a nation of law. And that somehow just seemingly doesn't matter as Obama stands poised with his pen to grant amnesty to to these people who yet again have invaded our country, and we're going to supposedly accept it.
We're going to take a break. We're going to be right back with Joe Hicks. And Joe, when we come back, I want to talk to you about a comment that Joe Biden made last week, and education as well, and how that could affect the black community in a not a very good way. Joe Hicks, our special guest here on the Gary Sutton Show. We'll be right back with him on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Joe Hicks, a member of the Project 21 Leadership Network, with us here on WSBA. Joe, I was struck by something that Vice President Biden said last week when he said, "These are our children. These are our children." And I stopped for a second. I said, "No, these are children from somewhere else, and somewhere else ought to be helping to take care of them right now. We ought to be getting them back to somewhere else." Obviously, there are times when we want people in our country, if they go back, they're going to be in a very, very bad place. But, this idea that we've been sold that these are our children and that there will be no difference in our country based on the fact that we're going to allow them to illegally come here is maybe one of the biggest lies visited on the American people, white, black, or any other color.
Joe Biden's a fool, and that's well known.
Other than that, how do you feel about him? No, I'm kidding you. I'm kidding you, Joe. Go ahead.
This notion that though they're our kids, well, as you pointed out, they're not our kids, and this sort of notion that it's our responsibility to have these kids foisted on us. See, the biggest lie being told here is that these kids are fleeing violence and gangs.
Right.
Those conditions have been prevalent in Central America as long as I've been alive. It's been endemic in all of those nations, as it is in Mexico with the cartels, and there are all sorts of countries around the world. Look at Ukraine. What conditions are kids living in certain parts of Ukraine right now? So, as I said, we can't open up our doors and just let everybody come here. We'd be hollowing out the population of many of these nations if we just allowed the struggling kids from all around the world to come here. The fact is, America and Americans are the most generous people on the face of the earth. We're largely a faith-based people. We believe in helping and doing things for others. Our foreign aid subsidizes many of those countries in places like Central America, for instance, that get a great deal of their income from the foreign aid we grant to them. There are church missions operating all throughout Central America trying to help kids and poor people. So this notion that, and again, it's the politics of Joe Biden, because what he's saying is you're a bad person if you don't agree with us that we're going to let these kids come in. Really what's at base here is the Democratic Party wanted to import as many new potential Democratic voters as they can. Because guess what? Those kids are going to grow up. Maybe they'll become citizens. Maybe they won't. But if they do become citizens, well, do you have to be a citizen these days to vote? I'm not sure anymore.
Well, and one other thought there, too, is the idea that Republicans don't come out or conservatives don't come out many times, or Republicans especially, I won't put them in with conservatives, don't come out and say, no, this is wrong, this is not what we should be doing, and yet they can't seem to come up with their own plan. And so, again, someone has to stand up strongly and say, wait a second, the rule of law does mean something, and what you do at the border means something. For example, with the 50,000 kids that have come in so far, and they're predicting that by October it might be as many as 90, we're looking at it and saying, now, what do we do to educate these kids? Where do we house them? I saw in your own city, the guy who was, I guess, been in charge of trying to find places for homeless people came to your mayor and said, what about us? What about us? You're making this mad scramble to try to find places for these people to live. What about us? And so a lot of people are saying that, I think, in the workforce. Teachers are saying it in the classrooms. What are we going to do with these people? How are we going to take care of them? Because we do have to take care of everybody in this country, according to a ruling a few years ago. So, I mean, there are unintended and maybe even intended consequences in this whole thing. Your final thoughts?
And of course, we're going to wind up paying the tab for this.
Exactly.
And beyond all that is the issue of the kind of new diseases that many of these young people are bringing into the country is going to cause, in some cases, medical issues for many of the communities that they're settled in. You just pointed out the stress this is going to place on the education system, that these kids, who in many cases can't even speak English, are going to flood into our schools. I mean, this is going to be a crisis that's going to reverberate across many of these border states and some places in the interior, because they're putting many of these kids on planes, flying them into the interior of the country, dropping them down in the middle of some unsuspecting community, and there they are. And it's going to put additional stress that is unnecessary. And I'm hoping that we can find some Republicans who will have the backbone to really oppose this. But you got Boehner and all these people that are saying, well, they're pushing amnesty. Yeah. As much as in some cases the Democrats are, because they're frightened. They're so scared that, oh my God, we'll be seen as mean people if we oppose this. No, stand up. Most Americans, right. You look at the polling, most Americans want these kids sent back.
Or businesses are putting pressure on them to say, don't do that. That's going to hurt us in the long run. Joe, we continue to talk about this. I hope that Democrats and Republicans alike will stand up and think about this before any kind of executive order is passed on and what it could really do to America. Joe, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for being with us today. I can't wait till our next time. Take care.
You got it.
Thanks. Right. Joe Hicks, Project 21 Leadership Network here on the Gary Sutton Show. When we come back, Kurt Smith was a speechwriter. He's also a political communications professor at the University of Rochester and former speechwriter for George H.W. Bush. And he's going to survey the national and international scene and maybe a thought or two about baseball. He's one of the foremost baseball writers in the country, too, and he'll join us at 11:05 on the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. It's 11 o'clock.